In the first half of this series, I took a look at the crew of the Next Generation era 7-inch Art Asylum figures. And as we saw in that video, Art Asylum put out an incredible amount of crew members for the Next Generation. It was a pretty strong line, and they managed not only to get out all the core crew members with several variants, but they also managed to get to some of the subsidiary and regular reoccurring characters as well. So today I'm going to turn my attention to the aliens and enemies from the Next Generation that were produced for this line. And, well, this will probably be a much shorter video, because they only seem to produce 3, and technically 2 of them are variants of the crew anyway. Because oddly, despite the success of the line and them producing so many supporting characters, they really didn't get around to producing many aliens from the TV show, which is pretty shocking since Next Generation introduced a whole host of interesting aliens and enemies across their 7 years. But sadly, we'd never get to see them in plastic form from Art Asylum. So first up we have Q, and the first thing to note is that he's in the Starfleet uniform, which he did wear several times throughout the show when he was mocking various characters, but I've got to be honest, of all the outfits they could have placed him in, this isn't the one I would have chosen. And this is mainly because we've got so many Starfleet uniforms in this collection. It would have been nice to have at least one of the aliens being something different, just to be a bit more distinctive and make the collection look a little bit more interesting. Now, the first outfit that comes to mind for me would be the judge's robes, and I know this has been done in toy form many times. It's almost a cliche when we think of Q, but that said, I do think it's a really strong visual look for this character, and looks pretty cool, and I think it works really well as a toy, so I probably would have really preferred to have had that. Now then, the head sculpt. I'm not too sure about this likeness. To be honest, when I look at the sculpt, the nose, the lips, the eyes, it all looks pretty accurate, to be honest, and I think, yeah, they've done a pretty decent job. But the hair seems really way off, like it just doesn't look like him, and somehow this spoils the entire sculpt, so it just doesn't really look that much like Q. Now, the articulation scheme is exactly the same as in the other figures we looked at in the last video, and it's the same for the others that I'm going to be looking at a bit later, so I'll just run through it again once here. He has a ball-jointed neck, so of course he can spin his head right the way around, and also it can look up and down within the limits of the hard collar that poses a little bit of hindrance here and there. He's also got ball-jointed shoulders, upper bicep swivel, single jointed elbow, and of course a swivel at the wrist. He's also got a swivel at the waist as well, so there's a fairly decent range of motion here, but it's pretty far from exceptional. Likewise, he's got a swivel at the hip, so his legs can kick out, and they bend at the knee 90 degrees, and again there's another swivel at the ankle as well. And whilst it's not terrible, it doesn't feel like it's really offering a whole lot of options. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking, well, they've just recycled one of the Starfleet bodies and stuck Q's head on it. That would be a nice cost-effective way for Art Asylum to get this figure out there, but as you can see when you put him next to, say, Picard, or even if you did the same with Riker, it's a completely different body mold and it has completely different grooves and creases within the costume. And this is something I do commend Art Asylum for, is that they did make little subtle differences with every single figure, so that each one was unique. And the only piece that they have recycled, as far as I can tell, is the hands. Here we can see he does literally have the same hands as Captain Picard, with the finger pointing out. Overall, I'm not really sure how I feel about this figure, to be honest. I'm really glad that we have a Q, and I'm not really adverse to him being in a Starfleet outfit, but as I said at the top of the video, I just would have preferred him to have something a bit more distinctive and a bit more interesting and different, and just something to help break up and diversify the collection, so it's not just a collection of endless Starfleet uniforms. And I think it's a real shame about the head sculpt, because it's pretty damn close. I mean, I think it does genuinely look like him, and yet somehow through a combination of the paint apps and that hair sculpt, it ends up looking quite far away from what I recognise as Q as well. So next up we have Lore, and of course he is essentially a resculpt or variant of Data, if you will. He appears in a handful of episodes of The Next Generation, and there's only really a couple of costumes they could have gone with. I have to say, I'm really pleased they went with this choice. This is definitely the one I would have chosen, which is from the Descent two-parter featuring the Borg. And that's kind of unusual for me, because this is probably the blandest of all of them. But I think the design and the story is probably the most significant, featuring Lore. Now, despite being essentially a variant of Data, the head sculpt actually is brand new, and we can tell this, of course, from the smile or the smirk that Lore has that Data never had. And in terms of the likeness, yeah, I think they've pretty much nailed it. I think this is a pretty good likeness of Brent Spiner, and I can't really fault it, to be honest. I think maybe in terms of the paint apps, it would have been nice for them to paint in his eyebrows, and maybe do something with the lips as well, because it's just missing that little bit of detail there that would have really enhanced the sculpt. Now, whilst I said that this is probably the blandest of all the outfits, I was of course talking about the tone, the paint apps here, because it is all just one flat colour, so there's no paint washes running through this or anything, which creates that sort of slightly dull look to it. But in terms of the sculpt, it is very nicely done. There's lots of little details in here, and it's quite nicely textured as well. Also, I think it's pretty screen accurate. Now, a quick word of warning to the wise. These figures, although they have pretty decent articulation, this one tends to struggle a lot more when it comes to the arms, and you do have to be very, very careful with some of these releases from Art Asylum because there is a tendency, for things to snap. So do be careful. So overall, I think this is a pretty cool figure. I think they've done a nice job of rendering what we see on screen. It's maybe not the most exciting release, but I for one am really glad to have a legitimate enemy in the collection, and Laura is a character I've always had a bit of affection for, so for me this is a real win. Okay, so I've saved my favourite for last, and this is of course Picard as Locutus of Borg. I'm really, really super pleased they managed to get this figure out. I'm a huge fan of the Borg. I think The Best of Both Worlds is probably the best episode of The Next Generation, and this is a hugely significant moment and character from the show. It's also important because whilst Art Asylum will go on to release a series of Borg figures, none of them will be based on the classic design. So I'm glad to have at least one classic Borg in this lineup. So first things first, when we talk about this head sculpt, it is a recycled head sculpt of the standard release Captain Picard figure. If you look closely, you'll realise it is pretty much the same sculpt. The only thing that's different here is obviously slightly different paint job and of course the extra pieces of Borg equipment on the sides of his temple and face. But what I would say is that I actually think the paint apps are so much better here. It actually makes the most of this sculpt and really brings out things like the eyes, for example. It just looks a lot better. It makes the sculpt look a lot better in my opinion. But in terms of how this compares with the look in the show, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag really, because they seem to have taken the body from the second part of The Best of Both Worlds where he has more armour around the chest area. But by that point he also had a lot more prosthesis on his face as well, and a lot more wires going out of it. The head sculpt to me looks like it's taken really more from part 1, where he has a lot less Borg equipment and technology on his body as a whole. Now, that is nitpicking, of course, and it really doesn't spoil the look of this figure at all, because I think it's a really solid sculpt all around, to be honest, and as I said, it is my personal favourite. The only thing I would have really done to improve it, to be honest, would to have maybe put a little light red dot on the side of his face there. That would have been really cool. And something I really have to praise Art Asylum for is the amount of attention to detail they've really put into this figure when it comes to all his wires and bits and pieces and grooves and detail, and they made the job harder for themselves because they did distinctively go for the look in part 2 where he has a lot more armour and a lot more Borg things going on, and very often when we see figures we usually get the look from part 1, from that cliffhanger moment where he actually has a lot less going on in terms of the upper body. But I really appreciate them going the extra mile here, and I feel like it's really paid off. The paint apps are excellent, and the overall sculpt is just really solid, and having those little extra wires pop in and out, although it can be a little bit fiddly and you have to be careful when you are posing the figure, I think they look fantastic. Also, I really like that they gave him a choice of 2 different arms, which is really cool. So they gave him this really long Borg arm, which is obviously much extended. Sadly, it isn't articulated, so none of the bits and pieces move on it, which would have been a really cool touch. But nevertheless, the sculpt is very, very nice, and the paint apps on it are excellent. And it definitely looks distinctly different and alien when you put this figure in the collection with this arm, because it just looks so elongated and strange. But they've also given you the option to have the gloved gauntlet as well, which I think is really cool, and of course it is articulated, so this looks really, really nice, and it's nice to have both options, so I'm really pleased with this. And well, there you have it. I'm afraid there's only the 3 figures. I did say this would be a shorter video, and it's a real shame because I do wish they just expanded this line a bit more with their aliens and enemies, because none of these figures are bad. Like I said, my clear favourite is Locutus, but I think Laura is really good, and Q, you know, I've got mixed feelings about Q, but it would have been cool to have another variant in there. I think of Q would have been great, but a few more aliens. I mean, I really wish I would love to get my hands on a Romulan. They did do a number of Klingons, so we can throw them in there from the Deep Space Nine line, but maybe a Ferengi or a Cardassian, or hell, even one of those fish guys from season 2 would have been fine. just something, anything really, to just diversify this collection and have some fun with it, because I think one of the joys and one of the real fun things of Star Trek is the alien worlds and the alien beings they encounter, and I think it has such a rich history and such a diverse array of aliens that they could have utilised. It would have been really, really fun to have them in figure form, but sadly they weren't meant to be as part of this line. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.